There's a crease by your eye, a line at the corner of your mouth, something you catch every single time you pass a mirror, and something you've probably spent actual money trying to soften. Here's what nobody tells you. Almost no one else registers it. Not because people aren't paying attention, because something else entirely is being scored, and it's being scored faster than you can blink. When you look at your own face, you don't scan it the way a stranger does. You fixate. One spot, over and over. The same line, the same shadow, the same asymmetry, until it grows in your head to a size it doesn't have on your actual face. Other people don't have that luxury of repetition. They see you once, briefly, and their visual system does something completely different. It reads proportion and balance across the whole face at once, not part by part. The coworker who sat across from you in yesterday's meeting almost certainly walked away with zero memory of the exact line you were self-conscious about that morning. Their brain wasn't built to store it. Yours is built to obsess over it because you're the only person on earth who sees that face from 4 inches away in bad bathroom lighting. But if the line itself isn't what's being read, something is. In 1946, a psychologist named Solomon Asch ran an experiment that's still taught in nearly every introductory psychology course. He gave 2 groups of people an identical description of a stranger: intelligent, skillful, industrious, determined, practical, cautious. 6 words, completely unchanged between groups. He swapped exactly 1 word. One group was told the person was also warm. The other was told cold. That single word didn't just add 1 more trait to a list. It rewrote the entire imagined personality underneath it. People who heard warm pictured someone generous, sociable, good-humored, someone they'd want at a dinner table. People who heard cold pictured someone calculating, closed off, someone you'd be careful around. 6 identical words, 1 substitution, and 2 completely different human beings appeared in people's heads. Now later, researchers went back and tried to replicate this exact effect, decades after Asch's original study, and what they found complicates the story. Warmth isn't always the trait that carries that much weight. In some conditions, it barely mattered at all, and a completely different trait, intelligence, ended up doing more of the work. So the specific finding, warmth beats everything, doesn't hold up cleanly. What does hold up across every version of the experiment is the underlying mechanism. People don't average traits together into a balanced impression. One trait, whichever one happens to land first in whatever context you're in, can flood everything else with its color. You are not assessed piece by piece. You are assessed as a single impression, built around whichever detail got there first. And that detail is almost never the wrinkle. It's the habit sitting underneath it. How easily your face defaults to something open versus something guarded, whether your shoulders drop or stay braced, whether your voice has room in it or sounds rationed. Here's the part that should actually worry you, or maybe relieve you, depending on how you look at it. This first impression doesn't take long to form, and it doesn't take long to stop changing. In 2006, researchers at Princeton showed people photographs of unfamiliar faces for exactly 1/10 of a second, literally faster than the blink of an eye, and asked them to rate the faces on trustworthiness, competence, and likability. Then, separately, they showed the same photographs to a different group with no time limit at all, as long as they wanted to look. The 2 sets of judgments were nearly identical. Giving people more time to study a face didn't make their read of it more accurate or more nuanced. All it did was make them more confident in the conclusion they'd already reached in 1/10 of a second. The extra time bought certainty, not correction. A separate study from 1993 pushed this even further, and this one had something real riding on the outcome, not just elaborating. Researchers took video of college professors teaching, stripped out the sound entirely, and cut it down to 30-second silent clips. No lecture content, no voice, just body language and expression. They showed those clips to people who had never met the professors and asked them to guess how the professors would eventually be rated by their actual students months later at the end of the semester. The strangers' 30-second silent guesses lined up closely with the real, semester-long evaluations. Then the researchers cut the clips down further, to 15 seconds, then 6 seconds, and the accuracy barely dropped. 6 seconds of silent footage was enough to predict a verdict that would otherwise take an entire semester to arrive at through actual classroom experience. So put those 2 findings together. The signal forms in a fraction of a second, and once it forms, more information doesn't revise it. It just cements it, which leaves one real question. If the read happens that fast and locks in that hard, what is it actually reading? What's underneath the 1/10 of a second? People who age into a genuinely good impression, the kind that gets described as there's just something about them, tend to share a specific, narrow set of behavioral habits, not a personality type. 3 show up again and again. First, they do something useful or generous for someone, and then they let it go. No follow-up mention, no quiet tally being kept. Second, they say what they actually want, plainly, without either burying it under false modesty or inflating it into a demand. Third, and this is the one people underestimate, when something genuinely warrants anger, they get angry in proportion to it, not swallowed down into nothing, not blown up past what the moment called for. Matched. All three of those are the same skill wearing different clothes, matching the size of a reaction to the size of whatever caused it. That's not the same as staying calm, and it's not the same as being expressive. It's calibration, knowing exactly how much of a response a given moment deserves, and delivering that much, and no more. Nobody is born knowing that scale. It gets built the hard way, through miscalibrating first, reacting too big to something small, staying too quiet about something that actually mattered, and adjusting after the fact, enough times that the adjustment eventually becomes automatic. That's why this tends to correlate with age, without being caused by age. Some people accumulate those correction cycles quickly. Some people, even well into their 50s, still haven't, and this calibration is the actual raw material behind the fast-reading signal from before. The expression, the posture, the voice with room in it. The face isn't a separate thing from the calibration. It's the visible residue of it. The same underlying skill, aimed in a different direction, is what makes a conversation feel deep instead of shallow. And it has almost nothing to do with how much any one person knows. Picture 4 people at a dinner table, splitting a bottle of wine. Someone glances at the label. Oregon, they say, mostly to themselves. There's a version of this moment that looks impressive and isn't. Willamette Valley, where a lot of Oregon wine actually comes from, is genuinely one of the most respected Pinot Noir regions in the world. Similar latitude to Burgundy, decades of serious winemaking behind it. Someone could hold the table for 2 straight minutes on soil composition and fermentation technique, and it would sound knowledgeable. It would also kill the conversation because it's a monologue wearing the costume of a discussion. Here's what an actual deep conversation looks like instead. Someone says, Oregon. Wasn't that where the wildfires wrecked a bunch of vineyards a few years back? I think the wineries ended up suing the power company over it. Someone else picks it up. Yeah, half the wineries out west can't even get fire insurance anymore, from what I've heard. A third person adds, almost as an aside, same thing's starting to happen with flood coverage where I live. Within 2 minutes, the table is moved from a wine label to climate risk to the insurance industry to their own neighborhoods, and not one more word gets said about the wine itself. By the end of the night, all 4 people will describe that as one of the better conversations they've had in a while. What made it work wasn't that any one person at that table knew more than the others, it was sequencing. The person who knew about insurance didn't jump in the moment the topic was adjacent to something they knew. They waited until the conversation actually arrived there on its own, and only then said something. Run the alternative version to see the difference. The second the word Oregon leaves someone's mouth, another person cuts in, Oh, Oregon, isn't that where Nike's headquartered? I went to the outlet mall there once. Not a wrong fact, not an unpleasant person, but the conversation stops dead because the comment didn't build on anything. It just redirected the room toward whatever the speaker happened to already have loaded and ready to say. That's not a knowledge gap, it's a timing gap. The ability to read what the room is actually curious about right now, and to recognize the exact moment your own knowledge becomes useful instead of intrusive. Expression, the size of an emotional reaction, the timing of a sentence in a conversation. All 3, it turns out, are downstream of the same single skill. Reading what a moment actually needs and matching your response to that, rather than to whatever you happen to be carrying around inside you at the time. None of that can be faked in the moment, and none of it can be studied into existence from a book the night before. It gets built the same way the emotional calibration gets built, slowly, through hundreds of small corrections, most of them invisible even to the person making them. So what is a face at 40 actually showing? Not the face. A record, an accumulated, fairly precise record, of how well someone has learned to match their reactions to what the moment in front of them actually required over several decades of getting that wrong just often enough to eventually get it right. The line you keep checking in the mirror every morning isn't being scored by anyone but you. Something else already was, and it only took 1/10 of a second.